keep a photograph in my desk drawer. Not on the wall, not on my phone. In a drawer, face down, under a stack of old utility bills. I keep meaning to throw away. I don't look at it often, but I know exactly where it is. It's from a Saturday in October, maybe 8 years ago now. My wife and I are standing in front of a food truck at some outdoor market. She's laughing at something, I don't even remember what, and I've got my arm around her shoulder and I'm looking at her instead of the camera. We look like two people who have absolutely no idea what's coming. I think about that photograph a lot. Not with regret, exactly. More like the way you think about a storm you survived, with a kind of quiet awe that you made it through, and a sadness for the version of yourself who didn't know was about to hit. This is the story of how I walked away from my marriage without saying a single word, and how she found me anyway. Her name was Elise. We met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, one of those loud restaurant tables where you can't really hear anyone, so you end up just talking to whoever's next to you. She was next to me. We talked for 3 hours, and I barely touched my food. She was a physical therapist. She had this calm, measured way of listening, really listening, not just waiting for her turn to speak. And I remember thinking that she must be extraordinary at her job. She made you feel like whatever you were saying mattered, like you mattered. I was 34. I had a decent job as a structural engineer, a one-bedroom apartment I'd been meaning to redecorate for 2 years, and no particular plan beyond getting through the week. Elise walked into that dinner and rearranged something in me. I don't know how else to describe it. We dated for almost 2 years before I proposed. I did it badly. No grand gesture, just the two of us in her kitchen on a Tuesday night. Me holding a ring I'd been carrying in my jacket pocket for 3 weeks, because I kept losing my nerve. She cried. I cried. We stood there in her kitchen holding each other, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is the thing. We were married the following spring. The first 2 years were good. Really good. Not perfect. We had our arguments, our friction, the small daily negotiations that come with building a life with another person. But underneath all of it was this bedrock of certainty. She was mine and I was hers. And that felt like enough. It felt like more than enough. Then her mother got sick. It happened fast. 1 month she was fine. The next she was getting a diagnosis, and by the time we fully understood what we were dealing with, it had already moved into her lymph nodes. Elise flew home to Wisconsin 3 times in 4 months. I went with her twice. I watched my wife become someone who woke up at 4 a.m. to check her phone, who stopped finishing sentences, who sat through dinner with her eyes somewhere else entirely. I tried to be there for her. I want to be honest about that, because it matters later. I cooked. I cleaned. I left her alone when she needed space and held her when she cried and drove her to the airport at 6 in the morning without complaint. I did all the things you're supposed to do. But I was grieving too, not her mother. Though I had grown fond of her. This small, fierce woman who called me by the wrong name for the first year and then pretended it was intentional as a joke. I was grieving my wife. The version of her who used to reach for my hand in the car. The version who laughed at my terrible puns and teased me about my inability to fold laundry correctly. She was still in there somewhere, but she had gone somewhere I couldn't follow. Her mother passed away in February. Elise came home from the funeral quiet in a way I hadn't seen before. Not sad. She had been sad for months. This was different. This was sealed shut. I gave her time. Weeks passed. I told myself grief had its own timeline, that she'd come back to me eventually. But the weeks became a month, and the month became 2, and one morning I realized that we hadn't had a real conversation, not about anything that mattered, in almost 60 days. I asked her if she wanted to see someone. A therapist. Maybe together, maybe separately. She said she was fine. I asked her if she wanted to talk about her mom. She said she wasn't ready. I asked what I could do. She looked at me with this expression I still can't fully decode. Not angry, not sad, just exhausted. And she said she didn't know. I understood that. I really did. But understanding something doesn't make it hurt less. Around month 3, she started coming home late. Not every night, maybe twice a week. She worked with a rehabilitation clinic, and they had expanded their hours, she said. New patients, new schedules. It made sense on paper. I told myself it made sense. But there was a shift. A specific, identifiable shift in how she moved through our apartment. She laughed more easily when she was on the phone. She kept her phone face down. She started going to a spin class on Saturday mornings, which she'd never done before. And she came home from those classes showered and changed. which struck me as odd, but which I filed under things I was being paranoid about. I wasn't being paranoid. I don't want to dwell on the details of what I found, because that's not really the point of this story. What I will say is that it was a text message, and it was unmistakable, and it was from a man I had met exactly once, a colleague of hers, and the text made it very clear that whatever was happening between them had been happening for at least 6 weeks. I sat on the edge of our bed for a long time after I read it. Long enough that the light changed in the room. Long enough that my legs went numb. I wasn't angry, which surprised me. I was something more like devastated. A quieter, more complete feeling. The kind that doesn't come with a sound. I didn't confront her that night. She came home at the usual time, made dinner, asked me about my day. I answered. I ate. I washed the dishes. I went to bed beside her and I lay there in the dark thinking. She doesn't know that I know. And that, somehow, felt like a kind of power I had never asked for and didn't want. Over the next few days, I kept waiting to feel rage. It didn't come. What came instead was a slow, grinding certainty that whatever we had built together had been built on something I didn't fully understand, and that I didn't know how to fight for a version of a marriage that might not have ever been exactly what I thought it was. I thought about confronting her. I ran the conversation in my head 100 times. I thought about couples therapy, about ultimatums, about all the things you're supposed to do. But every time I imagined sitting across from her and saying what I knew, I felt a tiredness so complete it was almost physical. Like my body had already made the decision my brain hadn't caught up to yet. I gave myself 2 weeks. I told myself, in 2 weeks, you'll have it figured out. You'll know what to say. At the end of those 2 weeks, I packed a bag. I didn't take much. Clothes, my laptop, the external hard drive with my work files, the charger for my phone. I left my wedding ring on the kitchen counter. Not dramatically, not positioned to be found, just set down like I was going out for groceries and forgot to put it back on. Maybe that was dramatic in its own way. I don't know. I texted my brother and told him I needed his couch for a few days. He asked me if everything was okay. I said it would be. Then I drove away. I didn't call. I didn't leave a note. I told myself that I'd reach out in a few days once I had my head straight, once I knew what I actually wanted to say. The few days became a week. The week became 2. At some point I stopped waiting to feel ready and started just moving through each day instead. My brother lived in Portland. I had always liked Portland without ever seriously thinking about living there. I started looking at apartments. I found a 1-bedroom near a park that was nothing special but was clean and had good light. And I signed a 6-month lease with the vague intention of reassessing at the end of it. I got a job transfer. My firm had an office in Portland, and my manager, a practical man who had been through a divorce himself years ago, didn't ask too many questions. I threw myself into work the way people do when they're trying not to think. Which is to say, I worked long hours and did good work and came home to an empty apartment and reheated whatever I'd made in bulk on Sunday and watched shows I don't remember now. Elise tried to reach me. She called, and then she texted, and then the call stopped, and I assumed she had figured out I wasn't going to pick up. I don't say that proudly. It was cowardly. I knew it was cowardly, but I had nothing to say that would make either of us feel better, and silence felt like the only honest thing I had left. I thought about her constantly. Not with longing exactly, or not only with longing. Mostly with that helpless feeling of not being able to understand where it went wrong, whether it was the grief, whether it was something in us that had always been slightly off-center and we'd been compensating for it without knowing, whether I had failed her somehow in those months after her mother died, whether if I had pushed harder or differently, she would have turned toward me instead of away. I'm still not sure I have an answer to that. About 18 months in, I started running. Nothing serious at first. Just 30 minutes in the morning to get out of my own head. Then longer. I signed up for a 10K, then a half marathon. I joined a running group that met on Sunday mornings at the park near my apartment. Mostly older people. Mostly quiet. The kind of company that requires nothing from you except showing up. Through the running group, I met a guy named Bart who became something close to a friend. He was 61, recently retired, had grown children and a good marriage and a dry sense of humor that I appreciated. He never asked me about my life in any direct way. He just showed up every Sunday and ran at my pace and occasionally made a comment about something completely unrelated to anything. And I found that I looked forward to Sundays in a way I hadn't looked forward to much of anything in a while. I started cooking again, reading. I went to a few therapy sessions and then stopped and then started again, which my therapist told me was completely normal and part of the process, though she said it in a way that made it clear she slightly disagreed. She helped me understand that what I had done, leaving without a word, was not just about Elise. It was about a pattern, a lifelong tendency to go quiet when things became too heavy to hold, to disappear rather than fight. That was uncomfortable to hear. It was also true. I'd been in Portland for almost 2 years when the email arrived. I almost missed it. It came in on a Thursday afternoon when I was buried in a deadline, and I saw the sender's name and I felt my whole chest do something involuntary. I closed the laptop, opened it again, closed it, made coffee. I didn't drink. Then I sat down and read it. She wasn't asking for anything. That was the first thing I noticed. No accusations, no explanations, no request for a response. It was 4 paragraphs, and it was careful, and it was clearly written and rewritten, the kind of email you spend a week composing. She said she understood why I left the way I did. She said she didn't think it excused it, but she understood it. She said she had spent a long time being angry at me, and then a long time being angry at herself. And she was tired of being angry. She said she had made a terrible choice during a terrible time, and that she had no defense for it except that she had been drowning and had grabbed onto something solid without thinking about what it would cost. She said she didn't know if I would ever read this or if I had moved on entirely, but she needed to say it somewhere, even into the void. She said she missed me. Not the marriage, not the version of things she wanted, just me. The specific, actual person I was. She said she hoped I was okay. I read it 6 times. I didn't respond that day, or the next. I took it to my therapist, which was the most useful thing I had done in therapy in months. We talked about it for 2 sessions. What I was afraid of, what I actually wanted, separate from what I thought I should want, what it would mean to respond, and what it would mean not to. On a Sunday morning about 3 weeks after the email arrived, I went for my usual run with the group. Bart fell into pace beside me around mile 2 and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, without any preamble, "You look like a man who's trying to talk himself out of something." I told him about the email. All of it, actually. The whole story, which I had never told him. He listened without interrupting, which took us almost to the end of the loop. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My wife and I separated for 11 months in 1998. Did you know that?" I didn't. We'd been married 9 years. I was convinced it was over. He shrugged. Then she called me. I almost didn't answer. Sometimes I think about that. The version of my life where I didn't answer. He didn't tell me what to do. He didn't need to. I called Elise that evening. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she had been waiting. We talked for 2 hours. It wasn't easy. Nothing about it was easy. She cried. I didn't. Not then. Though I did later. Alone in my apartment after we hung up. We didn't resolve anything in that first call. We didn't fix anything. But somewhere in the middle of it, she said, "I don't know if we can get back what we had." And I said, "I don't think we should try to get back what we had. I think what we had some things wrong with it." And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Yeah, I think that's right." That felt like the first honest thing we had said to each other in years. We took it slowly, more slowly than either of us probably wanted. We talked on the phone, then video calls. Then I flew back to see her for a weekend in a carefully neutral setting. A hotel, separate rooms, dinner at a place neither of us had been before. It was awkward in a way that felt almost appropriate, like we were introducing ourselves properly for the first time. She had been in individual therapy for over a year. She had ended things with the other man shortly after I left. Apparently, it had meant less to her than I'd feared, which was both a relief and somehow additionally painful in its own strange way. She had moved to a smaller apartment. She had taken up gardening, which surprised me because the Elise I had married had killed every houseplant she'd ever owned, with great confidence. We talked about what had happened, really talked about it, which we had never fully done during the marriage. About her grief and my silence and the way we had both handled crisis by going interior instead of toward each other. Her therapist had given her language for it. My therapist had given her language for it. My therapist had given me language for it. Between the two of us, we finally had enough words to say the things that had gone unsaid. It didn't erase anything. I want to be clear about that. There were nights on that first weekend when I lay awake in the hotel room feeling a grief so specific and complete that I couldn't breathe around it. Grief for the years. For the version of us that might have existed if we'd known then what we know now. You don't just decide to be okay with something and then be okay with it. It's slower and more non-linear than that. But I also knew, somewhere in a part of me I'd learned to trust, that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life wondering. We are not back to where we were. I think the point is that we don't want to be. We're doing something harder and more deliberate than that. She's still in the city we used to live in together. I'm still in Portland for now, though my 6-month lease has turned into something longer term, in a way I'm still thinking about. We see each other. We talk every day. We go slowly. And sometimes slowly feels like not fast enough. And sometimes it feels exactly right. My therapist says that what we're building requires two people who have done real work on themselves separately. I think she's right. I think that's the version of this story that might actually hold. There's a question I get asked in my head sometimes, by the version of myself that still shows up at 3 a.m., which is, was it worth it? All of it. The leaving, the years of quiet, the long way around, to a conversation we might have had much sooner if I hadn't been so afraid. I don't have a clean answer. I think there are some things you can only arrive at by going the long way. I think I needed to understand who I was without the marriage, before I could understand what the marriage had actually been. And I think Elise needed the same thing, though she arrived there differently than I did. What I know is this. She called me last week to tell me about a plant she's been growing from a seedling since early spring. She described it for about 10 minutes. It's a tomato plant. She was so pleased with it, and I sat there listening to her talk about this tomato plant, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt like myself. That photograph is still in my desk drawer, face down, under the utility bills. I don't think I'll throw it away, but lately I've been thinking maybe I'll turn it over. Not yet, but maybe soon. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened, not in any mystical way, just the plain, honest reality that what we do tends to come back around, one way or another. The choices I made, staying silent when I should have spoken, leaving without a word, disappearing like I could just subtract myself from the equation. None of those disappeared. They just traveled ahead of me and waited. Elise made a terrible choice during the worst year of her life. I'm not excusing it. But I also can't pretend that my silence before that, all those months of trying to manage her grief from the outside, of being patient and helpful without ever once saying I'm struggling too, I'm scared too, I need you too, played no part in what happened. That's the uncomfortable truth I had to sit with. We were both retreating. We just retreated in different directions. What I know now, and wish I'd understood 20 years earlier, is that doing the right thing quietly is not the same as doing the right thing. I cooked dinners and drove her to airports and gave her space, and I told myself that was love. It was, but it was also a way of avoiding the harder, more exposed version of love. The one that says out loud, I'm not okay, and I need us to talk about this. That takes something different than patience. It takes a kind of honesty that I hadn't yet learned to have. The intelligence I was missing wasn't intellectual. I had read the books. I understood grief conceptually. What I lacked was the emotional intelligence to recognize that two people can be in the same house, going through the same loss, and be completely invisible to each other. And that invisibility is not neutral. It grows. It creates distance that, if you wait long enough, starts to feel like the shape of things. Walking away was the first truly courageous thing I did in that marriage, which is a strange and painful thing to admit, not because leaving was right. How I left was wrong, and I've said so to Elise and to myself, but because it forced me to stop hiding inside the role of the stable, uncomplaining one. When you remove yourself from everything familiar, you find out fairly quickly who you are without the props. I didn't entirely like what I found at first, but at least it was real. What Bart said to me on that run, about almost not answering his wife's call, about the version of his life where he didn't, stays with me. We are always a few small decisions away from a completely different story. The courage isn't in the grand gesture. It's in picking up the phone. It's in reading the email instead of closing the laptop. It's in saying, I think we had had some things wrong with it, instead of pretending nothing happened, or letting pride make the decision for you. I don't know exactly where things with Elise are going. I'm not sure she does either. What I know is that we are both showing up differently than we used to. More honestly, more carefully, with a lot more awareness of how much damage silence can do when it becomes a habit. That's not nothing. After everything, that feels like it might actually be enough to build on. The photograph is still in the drawer, but I think I'll turn it over soon.